So, as I keep on telling you again and again, because it's worth repeating, one of the things that especially the Brexiteers are to their core is that they are free market fundamentalists. And as I keep on reminding people, what is a free market fundamentalist? You might have never heard of this term before when we refer to someone who is one of these types. And essentially, what they are is they believe that the market should have absolutely no regulation at whatsoever. The government should just simply not be involved at any level at all, have its fingers in any level of the economy. No regulation. The market should just run wild and capitalism should be done freely because apparently that's when it's at its best. However, as I'm sure you may yourself be able to name, there are multiple examples of when rampant capitalism has essentially just gone and destroyed economies after economies, jobs. It has widened the wealth gap even more. And we saw that especially during the 80s with Margaret Thatcher's original, quote, Big Bang. But now, a lot of these Tories are now desperate to recreate this Big Bang post-Brexit, a post-Brexit bang 2.0, if you will. So, before we jump into today's article, please do remember to hit that like and share button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link. And thank you very much to all the people who do support me that way. So, on with the article. So, this comes from The Guardian, and the title is, Less regulation means more business for the city, right? It's not that simple. Being a specialist in financial service regulation is a great way to make sure you never talk about your job at parties. It's complicated and it's boring, and the only times it's ever in the news are exactly the times when everyone hates you because something has gone badly wrong. Nevertheless, it is important, and it ought to be in the news a bit more at the moment because one of the UK's biggest industries in terms of output, employment, and yes, tax revenue is under serious threat. After more than 20 years in the business, I've come to the conclusion that almost nobody understands the single most important thing about the City of London from an economic point of view. And it's that regulation isn't a constraint on the financial sector, it's a vital commodity input. And what do I mean by that? For example, it's a false hope when the Chancellor tries to claim that by being nimble with stock exchange listing rules, the City of London can claw back enough market share to make up for the business it's going to lose as the result of Brexit. Together with his talk of a, quote, Big Bang 2.0, a reference to Margaret Thatcher's financial liberalisation in the 1980s, it seems clear that Rishi Sunak is working off a wrong economic model, which is not any less wrong because it's shared by nearly everyone working in the industry and by nearly all external city critics of finance. The model is one where you can run the financial services industries hotter or colder by effectively grabbing hold of a big dial and twisting it in the direction marked regulation or deregulation. Plenty of the city people voted Leave pretty much based on this exact model. They thought that Europe had twisted the dial far too towards regulation and that an independent Britain could turn it back the other way. The trouble is that regulation is not undifferent quality that you can pour out more or less of. Each individual regulation is precious and unique, interacting with all the others to produce a complex, occasionally bizarre, but basically coherent system which constitutes the financial environment in which it's possible to do financial business at all. And like maritime safety or perhaps the pharmaceutical industry standards, where every rule is a tombstone, the majority of them are on the books because something went badly wrong at some point in the past. That means if you try to have a bonfire of regulations, you're also going to have a bonfire of the actual industry. The great competitive advantage that the two world capitals of finance, London and New York, possesses is precisely that they've got rules for nearly everything. That means that things are predictable. Constraints aren't going to depend so much on interpretation, and the financiers can spend their time worrying about actual financial risks, the ones which arise partly from the uncertainty of the world and partly from the fact that a few hundred very clever, quite greedy people are trying to rip each other off all the time. In the context of the City of London and Brexit, this way of thinking about regulation gives you another way of looking at the problem. Basically, you can divide the British financial industry into four parts. Firstly, you've got the stuff that's basically domestic, or really purely, or related purely to Asian or American clients with no European angle to them. This stuff you wouldn't expect to be affected by Brexit. Then you've got purely European stuff. That's where it's obvious it has to move to the continent because it was hard to justify it being here in the first place. Although the Bank of England governor has to make a show of things, I really haven't met anyone in the industry who doesn't agree that the European central banks has control over its own currencies and future markets. Then there are two other categories. These things are Europe related, but do so much that they couldn't be done in London if it were more convenient to do so, thanks to the extremely useful legal system and all those experienced English-speaking specialists and so on. And finally, there's what you might call the offshore business. That's the thing people in London do because they don't want to get caught doing them back home. These are usually tax and security shenanigans, where the work is done and the fees are charged in London, but the legal ownership of assets is scattered across a triangle of Commonwealth states with poor transparency agreements, and it's these two last categories that could be affected by regulation. The death and the dream of, well, shall we say, the dream of the libertarians, of course, is to massively inflate that last category. But it's a dangerous dream, because there is more or less a straightforward trade-off between the category and the one I listed immediately before. The more dodgy stuff you allow, the further your regulatory system departs from that of Europe. Then the less acceptable of a substitute you are for ordinary Europeans and people to want to do business with them. And that matters. Because the one thing that libertarian right and the anti-finance left have in common is a tragic misunderstanding of the size of the dodgy offshore stuff. Niche in British finance is not that big. Certainly not when compared to the very significant or most part of the financial UK sector that does more or less straightforward deals with straight European corporate treasures and regional savings banks. This fact is, unfortunately, that Brexit was a disaster for the financial services industry, and there's nothing much that can be done about it. The Europeans are going to use this as an opportunity to try and grab a market share, and we have a very limited ability to actually able to stop them. Any attempt to try and use our own regulatory system as a competitive advantage will make things worse. We're bound to lose output and employment, and we've gained exactly nothing in terms of independence. There is no pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. And there you have it, straight from, the horse's mouth. That's a financial industry regulatory guy who basically says, yeah, you don't want to do this. You don't want to deregulate things. Rules are there for a reason. But again, we have these libertarians, or as I like to call them, the free market fundamentalists, who believe that somehow this should be a good thing. But of course, that's part of the problem, because that's when the offshore stuff, which is, as he said, is a lot bigger than you think, especially to do with London and the UK, that's where the dodgy stuff goes on. And the problem is, the less you lower the regulations, the more that stuff is allowed to come into the UK, and the more problems that will cause for us, and essentially the less grip on, the world financial stage London will have, which will impact the UK massively, because the City of London is a massive tax cow for the UK. Massive. And this is the problem where we are now. because these deregulations are coming sooner or later. And as they always said there, these regulations are there because something in the past went horribly wrong. And my worry is that some of these regulations get removed and those mistakes of the past come back to haunt us. And that could end very, very, very badly. So, as always, please do remember to hit that like and share button on your way out. And of course, down below, there's links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.